The first sound was not music. It was a whisper. She must feel awful sitting there all alone. The words slithered through the golden air of the wedding hall, sharp enough to slice through silk, soft enough to masquerade as sympathy. Charlotte Mitchell heard them, though the women who spoke did not look her way. They didn't need to. The remark was meant to linger in the space around her, a ghost that clung to her shoulders more tightly than the navy gown she had stitched with her own trembling hands. And suddenly, the string quartet's graceful notes, the laughter of bridesmaids, the crystalline clinking of champagne flutes, all of it dimmed. For Charlotte, there was only that whisper curling around her like smoke. It wasn't new. It had followed her since childhood. The shadow twin, the quiet one, the girl without a story. The vineyards of Napa Valley stretched endlessly under the late afternoon sun. Rows of vines glittered like green rivers, their leaves quivering with hints of gold. At the center of it all, a sprawling estate rose from the earth like a promise. White columns carved balconies and lawns, manicured to a fault. To the guests gathered there, it was paradise, a slice of European grandeur, transported to California's wine country. Inside, chandeliers dripped fire from 100 crystal drops, scattering stars across polished marble. The air smelled of roses and lavender, of wealth and permanence. Waiters glided like dancers, their silver trays bearing champagne that shimmered under the light. Every guest seemed adorned in silk or velvet laughter, falling from their lips like coins into a fountain. It was a wedding, plucked straight from the pages of a luxury magazine, and at the very center, glowing like a flame no shadow could dim, was Celeste Mitchell, Charlotte's twin. Celeste stood with her new husband, Dr. Taroutin, Andrew Whitmore, a rising cardiologist whose reputation already brushed the edge of brilliance. He clasped her hand with the secure authority of a man accustomed to saving lives while photographers orbited like satellites. Celeste's gown was a triumph of satin and lace, fitted to her curves as if destiny itself had chosen it. Her veil spilled behind her like silver water, catching every glimmer of light. Her laughter rang bright, effortless, the kind of sound that made people lean closer, hungry to share in it. Guests murmured, "Perfect and lucky," and of course, it would be Celeste. Charlotte, seated at the farthest table by the wall, listened with a practiced smile. The resemblance between them was undeniable. The same almond eyes, the same high cheekbones. But where Celeste glowed, Charlotte seemed cloaked. Where Celeste dazzled, Charlotte dissolved. Not that she hadn't tried. Her gown, deep navy silk, bore the mark of her craft. Every stitch was her own, every fold intentional. As an interior designer in San Francisco, Charlotte had built her life on details, on coaxing beauty from shadows. Yet here in the blaze of her sister's spotlight, she felt invisible. Invisible and exposed. Still single, the whispers hummed, and at her sister's wedding too. Poor Charlotte. She kept her eyes fixed on the rim of her wine glass, swirling the last drop as though it were an anchor. She would not cry. Not tonight. Not here among strangers dressed in silk and smugness. But the ache pressed harder. Every wedding glance became a mirror, reflecting what she lacked. No partner, no grand life, no perfect story. Only work bills and a studio apartment crammed with sketches and fabric samples. She loved Celeste truly fiercely, but love did not erase the sting of being compared again and always found wanting. Celeste the radiant, Charlotte the reserved, Celeste the chosen, Charlotte the forgotten. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She checked it, desperate for distraction, but it was only the time. Barely 8 o'clock. Too early to leave without insult. too early to slip back into anonymity. So she sat spine straight, lips curved in a mask of politeness, while inside her chest, the hollowness grew heavier. It was then she felt it. The air changed subtly at first, like a pressure drop before a storm. A scent cologne, sharp and refined, cut through the sweetness of roses. Shadows shifted across the marble floor. Conversations faltered, laughter thinned. Charlotte lifted her eyes, and the room seemed to fall silent. A man stood at the entrance, tall, broad-shouldered. His suit was cut, with the precision of a blade, black wool whispering of wealth, so deep it no longer needed to shout. His hair was dark, his jawline sharp enough to wound. But it was his eyes that held the power. Steel gray, unwavering, the kind of gaze that claimed spaces without permission. Heads turned as if compelled. Guests nudged each other, whispers rippling outward in recognition. Charlotte's breath caught. She knew the name before anyone spoke it. Charles Martin. The billionaire whose empire in artificial intelligence had reshaped industries, whose company's skyscraper in downtown San Francisco gleamed like a monument to progress. The man who appeared on magazine covers, but rarely at social events. Elusive, unreachable, untouchable. And he was walking toward her. Her pulse stumbled. Surely he sought someone else. Perhaps the groom, a friend from university days. Perhaps a senator, a donor, anyone but her. But Charles's steps carried him unerringly to her table at the far edge of the hall. He paused only a moment, then pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down with deliberate calm. Charlotte froze. Her mouth opened, ready to tell him the seat was taken, that there must be some mistake. But before a sound could leave her throat, he leaned close, so close, she felt his breath graze her ear. "Pretend you're with me." The words were velvet and steel all at once. Charlotte's heart thundered. "Excuse me," she whispered, but Charles's gaze never wavered. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her toward a cluster of guests, whose eyes were trained on him with calculating hunger. "They're watching," he murmured low enough that only she could hear. "If you don't mind, let them believe." Charlotte's cheeks burned. All at once the narrative around her shifted. She was no longer the forgotten twin, the lonely sister. She was the woman beside Charles Martin. The room buzzed with curiosity, envy, speculation, and with one sentence, a stranger had rewritten her story. She gripped her glass, her fingers trembling. "Why me?" She managed her voice a thread. Charles's lips curved, not quite a smile. His eyes, still fixed on the distant crowd, glinted with something unreadable. "Because you looked like you needed saving as much as I did." The answer struck her like a chord she had forgotten existed. Saving. The word unfurled in her chest, half a wound, half a promise. Before she could reply, he reached for her glass, filling it smoothly with fresh wine, the gesture so practiced, it looked intimate. Gasps rose nearby, whispers sharpened. Charlotte's pulse raced. This was madness, and yet some part of her, hidden reckless, leaned toward the madness. Moments later, Charles rose from his chair. The hall seemed to inhale as he extended his hand toward her palm, open command, disguised as courtesy. "Dance with me." Her breath hitched. "I don't dance," she whispered. "You do tonight." The firmness in his tone allowed no refusal, and so, against the protests of reason, Charlotte set her trembling hand in his. His grip was steady, warm. The quartet swelled into a waltz. Charles guided her to the center of the polished floor, where couples parted, instinctively making space. Charlotte stumbled at first, her body stiff with fear. But Charles's hand at her waist was a compass drawing her into rhythm, anchoring her against the storm of eyes. "Relax," He murmured, his lips near her ear. "They're watching. Let them see what they want." A shiver traveled down her spine. Slowly, impossibly, her steps began to flow. The music lifted them. The crowd blurred into shadow. And for a fleeting moment, it was only the two of them, her pulse and his colliding in the space between. When the music ended, Charles did not release her immediately. He bowed his head, his lips brushing the edge of her ear. "See you soon." Charlotte Mitchell. Her name on his tongue was a revelation. Then he stepped back, calm, decisive, the crowd parting for him as if the air itself obeyed. Charlotte stood breathless in the center of the floor. 1,000 whispers surrounded her, but she heard none of them. Her world had tilted, her story had shifted, and the man who had whispered "pretend" was walking away, leaving her with questions she could not yet answer. Charlotte returned to her table, her hands trembling, her glass untouched. But the room had reshaped around her. No longer did the glances carry pity. No longer did the whispers sting. They now brimmed with speculation, envy, intrigue. Her solitude had ended with 3 words, and she knew deep in her racing heart that nothing would ever be the same again. It had been 7 days, and yet the echo of his voice refused to leave her. Charlotte Mitchell had returned to her life in San Francisco, the small studio tucked above a row of cafes in the Mission District, the scent of roasted beans wafting through the cracked window panes, rolls of fabric leaning against the wall like soldiers waiting for command. She had thrown herself into work as if sketches and swatches might scrub the memory clean. But memory is not so easily erased, especially when it carries the weight of steel-gray eyes and a voice that cut through a wedding hall like prophecy. She had told herself it was nothing. An interlude. A moment of performance at her sister's wedding that meant little outside those glittering walls. She had convinced herself she had stepped back into invisibility, where she belonged, where she was safe. But then the knock came. It was not polite, not hesitant, but decisive, as though the visitor already owned the right to enter. Charlotte, pencil in hand, frowned and pushed back from her drafting table. She opened the door, and the air left her lungs. Charles Martin stood in the doorway. The billionaire did not belong here among chipped banisters and the lingering scent of old coffee. His presence filled the cramped hallway, as though he were too vast for such confines. He wore a tailored suit, though slightly less severe than the one from the wedding, as if he had made the smallest concession to casualness. But nothing about him was casual. Not the calm intensity in his eyes, not the way silence bent around him, not the way Charlotte's pulse betrayed her hammering so loudly she feared he might hear it. "Mr. Martin." She managed her voice unsteady. "You're early," he interrupted smoothly, stepping inside, without waiting for permission. His gaze swept the studio sketches strewn across the table, bolts of fabric stacked in precarious towers, a chipped mug of cold coffee forgotten near the sewing machine. To anyone else, it might have looked cluttered. To him, perhaps it was evidence of a mind that created worlds out of scraps. Charlotte's spine stiffened. "You can't just walk in here." His eyes flicked to hers, sharp and unyielding. "I needed to see you." "Why?" He closed the door behind him, and for a moment the hum of the city outside vanished. His presence narrowed the world to 2 people in a too-small studio. "Because what happened at your sister's wedding wasn't a coincidence," Charles said, his voice low, deliberate. "It worked." Charlotte blinked. "Worked." He stepped closer, not menacing, but impossible to ignore. The attention shifted. The questions stopped. The people who were trying to corner me with arrangements I didn't want, they backed away the moment you were at my side. His mouth curved faintly, though it was not a smile. You saved me, and you didn't even mean to." Charlotte's laugh was brittle, an attempt at deflection. "I didn't save anyone. I sat there and pretended for a dance." That was enough. His gaze caught hers, steady, unwavering. "Which is why I'm here now." She folded her arms across her chest, armor against the storm she sensed was coming. "What exactly are you asking me, Mr. Martin? Call me Charles." "I'd rather not." "Then, don't call me anything," he said with a flicker of amusement, before his tone sharpened again. "What I need, Charlotte, is simple. Continue what you started at the wedding. Pretend to be my partner. Publicly. At events, galas, board dinners, anywhere eyes are watching." The room tilted. She gripped the edge of her work table, her knuckles whitening. "You can't be serious." "I am." Charlotte shook her head, incredulous. "So, your solution to whatever rich man problem you have is to hire a stranger to play your girlfriend, not hire." His voice was even, but there was an undercurrent of steel. "Ask. I don't trust easily, but I trusted you that night, and it worked better than I expected." Her laugh this time was sharp-cutting. "You trusted me. You don't even know me." "I know enough," he countered swiftly. "I know you weren't dazzled by me. I know you didn't cling or beg or angle for attention. You treated me like a man who interrupted your evening, not a billionaire whose signature can move markets. That's precisely why it worked. You're believable." His words stung because they rang too close to truth. Charlotte had never been dazzled by wealth. She'd grown up watching her mother work double shifts just to keep their lives stitched together. Money to her was never romance. It was necessity. Still, she lifted her chin. "You realize how absurd this sounds. I have a life, a career. I can't just drop everything to play a part in your story." He stepped closer again, and suddenly the walls seemed too near the air, too thin. "I'm not asking you to drop everything. I'm asking you to stand beside me, when necessary. Publicly. In return, you gain access to a world that could benefit your work, clients. Investors' exposure you'd never reach alone." Her heart twisted. He had struck at the softest place, the quiet dream she had carried for years, to see her designs, not only in modest apartments, but in grand spaces, places that mattered. To have her name spoken with respect, in rooms where power gathered. Still, pride flared in her chest. "So I trade my dignity for exposure." Charles's eyes softened, just slightly enough to unsettle her. "Not dignity. Partnership. You set your terms." The silence stretched between them, taut and electric. Charlotte's mind raced, torn between indignation and temptation. She wanted to laugh him out the door, to slam it shut on this impossible man with impossible propositions. But another voice, quiet, insistent, whispered that this was not chance, that maybe fate had walked into her studio dressed in a tailored suit. She exhaled slowly, her chest tight. "All right, here are my conditions. I can walk away whenever I choose. No questions asked. And if I agree to this, I will not be treated like a prop." For the first time, his mouth curved into something that resembled approval. "Of course. I don't want a prop. I want someone who can match me." The way he said it made her stomach twist, because it did not sound like flattery. It sounded like truth he had already calculated. Her gaze dropped to the sketches scattered across her desk, the fragile blueprints of a future she feared would never come. When she lifted her eyes again, she felt the weight of a choice pressing down. "Fine," she said at last, her voice quieter than she intended. "Temporary. That's all this is." Charles extended his hand, the gesture formal, sealing something that felt dangerously like a contract. Charlotte hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, warm. The kind of hold that suggested permanence even when the words denied it. Temporary, she repeated, as if the repetition could protect her. For now, he murmured. She pulled her hand back quickly, needing space, needing air. What happens next? He glanced at his watch, the movement precise. Next weekend, a charity gala in San Francisco. Be ready. With that, he turned toward the door, leaving her studio as swiftly as he had entered. Charlotte stood in the silence he left behind, her pulse thundering, her mind a storm. She had agreed to a game she did not fully understand, a role that promised both opportunity and danger. As the door clicked shut, she whispered to the empty room, "What have you just done?" Charlotte Mitchell, the question hung in the air unanswered, trembling like a string pulled too tight. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and pride and disbelief, her heart knew this: nothing would ever be temporary again. The black Bentley pulled up to the curb outside Charlotte Mitchell's apartment building, just as the last colors of twilight bled into the streets of San Francisco. She stood at her window, watching the car idle beneath the streetlight, its polished frame gleaming like liquid shadow. Her heart thudded against her ribs with a rhythm she could not control. She had told herself all week that she would not be nervous, that this was only performance, only pretense. Yet, as she smoothed the folds of the black dress, she had chosen simple, elegant, a creation of her own hands. Her fingers trembled. The driver stepped out immaculate in posture and gloves and opened the rear door with a gesture of quiet authority. Charlotte inhaled, steadying herself, then descended the stairs. The evening air was cool, brushing against her skin, with the faint scent of the ocean drifting from the bay. She could feel eyes on her from the neighboring windows, blinds shifting just enough for curious glances to peek through. They all saw her stepping into a world she had never belonged to, a world that glittered and devoured in equal measure. Inside the car, Charles Martin sat waiting. He did not look up immediately as she slid into the seat beside him. He was adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, a silver tie gleaming faintly in the dim interior. When his gaze lifted, it swept over her like an appraisal, sharp and unrelenting. "You clean up well," he said at last, his voice even. Charlotte narrowed her eyes, uncertain if it was meant as compliment or observation. That sounds dangerously close to condescension. The corner of his mouth curved, the faintest hint of amusement breaking his usual reserve. It's an observation, and a favorable one. She looked away, her chest tightening in ways she refused to acknowledge. The car glided smoothly through the city headlights, painting streaks across the window glass. With every passing block, her nerves coiled tighter. She repeated to herself silently, "It's a role. It's nothing more. It's temporary." When they arrived at the museum, she realized how foolish her reassurances had been. The building rose before them like a palace of marble and glass, its facade bathed in golden light. A crimson carpet spilled down the steps where photographers clustered like hunters, cameras flashing with relentless hunger. As the Bentley eased to a stop, the air outside pulsed with expectation. Charles stepped out first, his presence commanding without effort. He turned, extended a hand toward her. For an instant she hesitated, every instinct screaming to run back into the shadows. But then she placed her hand in his, and his grip steadied her as he guided her into the blaze of cameras. The moment her heels touched the carpet, the world erupted. Flashes blinded her, voices shouted questions she could not decipher. The weight of it pressed against her chest, threatening to crush. She might have faltered, might have fled, had it not been for the warmth of Charles's hand at her back, firm anchoring. It reminded her of the silent command he had given on the dance floor at her sister's wedding. "Relax." Inside the museum, chandeliers spilled light across marble floors, their glow catching on canvases and sculptures worth fortunes. Guests moved like constellations in gowns of silk and suits stitched in London glasses of champagne held like trophies. Charlotte accepted one when offered, though her fingers betrayed her trembling just enough for the liquid to slosh against the rim. A soft laugh floated from nearby. "She looks out of place," a woman whispered loud enough to wound. Charlotte's throat tightened, heat rushing to her cheeks. She lowered the glass, wishing the ground might open beneath her. Then Charles's voice cut through, smooth and deliberate pitched, just loud enough for others to hear. "Careful," he said, his eyes glinting with calculated ease. "You're trying to outshine the champagne." A ripple of laughter moved through the group, but this time it was warm, amused, rather than cruel. Even the woman who had mocked her chuckled, disarmed. Charles reached, steadying Charlotte's hand, as if the gesture were second nature, his thumb brushing hers, with practiced intimacy. The tension fractured, dissipating into air. "You're infuriating," she muttered under her breath, when the attention shifted away. And yet he replied softly, eyes never leaving hers. "You're still here." The evening unfolded like a performance, and Charles was a master conductor. He guided her from conversation to conversation, introducing her to investors, politicians, philanthropists. Every time she faltered, he interjected with a remark that shifted focus. Every time the spotlight threatened to burn, he absorbed it, shielding her with his calm control. And yet beneath the polish, Charlotte began to notice something else. Charles never stopped scanning the room. His smile was precise, but never careless. His eyes sharp with calculation. It was as if every person, every gesture, every whispered word was catalogued in his mind, weighed and measured for meaning. He carried authority not by demanding it, but by existing within it, as though the world itself bent to his presence. Hours later, when the gala drew toward its close, Charlotte collapsed into the leather seat of the Bentley with a sigh, her heels abandoned beside her. "Do people actually enjoy those things?" she asked, exhaustion pulling at her voice. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, his composure still intact. "Some do. I endure them." She laughed softly, surprising herself with the sound. "Well, you endure them very convincingly." For a fleeting moment, something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of softness beneath the steel. He looked away quickly, as if unwilling to let the crack remain. The following morning, Charlotte expected silence. She expected him to vanish as abruptly as he had appeared in her life, their performance archived as a completed scene. But the knock on her studio door shattered that assumption. He stood there not in a suit, but in dark jeans and a jacket that still managed to look impossibly expensive. In his hands were 2 grocery bags, the contents barely visible. "You skipped breakfast," he said flatly, stepping inside before she could protest. Her brows shot up. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because you always do," he answered, setting the bags on her counter. Charlotte's indignation tangled with disbelief. "You can't just barge in here with groceries like a man who intends to eat with you." His tone carried no apology. "Come on, you need food, and I need a lesson in the real world." Within an hour, they were in the aisles of a crowded neighborhood supermarket, pushing a squeaky cart beneath fluorescent lights. Charles inspected boxes of cereal as though they were artifacts. Frosted Flakes, he read aloud, brows furrowing. Is this considered food or sugar disguised as food? Charlotte laughed so suddenly she startled herself. Both. If you want something classic, go with Cheerios. He placed the box in the cart with exaggerated care. Noted. Functional, not flashy. That's your philosophy, isn't it? She arched a brow, amused. You think you have me figured out? Not even close. They moved through the aisles, their banter weaving between playful and revealing. He questioned everything: pasta brands, canned soup, coffee blends, and she answered with the ease of someone who had lived in the world he only touched at a distance. For the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire, but as a man awkwardly pushing a shopping cart, sleeves rolled, trying to fit into a space too ordinary for him. Back in her studio kitchen, they cooked together in the cramped space. Charlotte stirred sauce while Charles, surprisingly adept, chopped vegetables with precise strokes. He looked out of place among chipped mugs and second-hand appliances, yet strangely at ease. You're not half bad at this, she admitted, handing him a spoon to taste the sauce. I'm a quick learner, he replied, and when his expression softened, at the flavor, warmth bloomed in her chest. Later, as they sat down to eat, laughter filled the small room. The contrast struck her sharply. The chandeliers of the museum, the marble halls of wealth, and now this mismatched plates pasta steaming in chipped bowls, laughter that felt unguarded. She realized with a jolt that she preferred this version of him, and it terrified her. That night when he left the studio felt emptier than usual. She stood by the window watching his car disappear into the fog-draped streets, her hand pressed to her chest as though to steady the storm within. This was supposed to be performance, pretend, temporary. And yet the line between act and reality blurred more with every passing moment. The next event arrived sooner than she expected, a networking dinner at one of the tallest skyscrapers in the city. As they stepped into the glittering room, her emerald dress shimmering beneath the lights, Charlotte told herself again and again that she was only playing a part. But when Charles's hand pressed lightly against her back, steady and protective, she could not tell where the role ended and the truth began. And as she looked up at him across the crowded room, with the city's skyline glittering through the glass walls, she realized she had stepped into something far more dangerous than she had agreed to. She had stepped into him, and there was no pretending her way out of it. The dinner was already in full swing by the time Charlotte and Charles stepped through the towering glass doors of the skyscraper. The room shimmered with power. It wasn't the chandeliers or the polished marble floors that gave it that weight. It was the people, venture capitalists, senators, tech moguls, and business strategists, moved in polished circles. Glasses of wine tilted in their hands, like extensions of their confidence. The hum of conversation was constant, punctuated by the occasional sharp laugh or the clink of crystal. It was the kind of room where reputations were made and ruined in a single whisper. Charlotte's emerald gown hugged her form, the silk catching every shard of light as she moved. It was Celeste's dress, borrowed from her sister's closet, though Charlotte had altered it with her own hands until it felt hers. Still, as she stood at Charles's side, her heels clicking across the marble, she felt every eye on her and wondered if they all knew the truth, that she did not belong, that she was a designer with more dreams than money, playing the role of a billionaire's partner. Charles, of course, seemed unbothered. His presence cut through the room as effortlessly as a blade through water. He greeted old colleagues, investors, even politicians with nods measured to the millimeter. His hand brushed against Charlotte's back, now and then a quiet reminder that she was not alone, though the gesture carried a weight far beyond comfort. Every time his touch lingered, her chest tightened. Every time he leaned slightly toward her, she felt her pulse quicken, as though she were standing too close to fire. She smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, answered questions with the grace of someone used to hiding nerves beneath politeness. Charlotte Mitchell. Charles would introduce, his voice cool, and even someone very important to me. The words always startled her, sending heat to her cheeks. The guests accepted them easily, their faces breaking into knowing smiles, their eyes gleaming with curiosity. She played along, but beneath the veneer, she whispered to herself, temporary, only temporary. And yet, when a senator's wife pressed too eagerly, asking how long they had been together, Charles slid his hand across Charlotte's on the table, his thumb brushing against her knuckles, as though the gesture had been written into their very bones. Long enough, he said softly, his eyes locked with hers. The guest laughed, charmed, and moved on, but Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. When the hand withdrew, she almost reached for it again. The evening should have felt seamless, but there was an undercurrent, subtle yet sharp, that Charlotte could not ignore. A name drifted through conversations more than once, carried like a secret that didn't want to stay hidden. Victor Cross. She had never met him, but the way people said his name made her skin prickle. Some spoke with admiration, others with quiet caution, but all with recognition. He was Charles's second-in-command at Martin Technologies, the man who had been by his side as the company grew into an empire. Twice as she passed near the bar, she caught hushed words that chilled her blood. "Cross is moving money offshore," one man whispered. "If anyone digs too deep, it'll explode," another replied. Her chest tightened. She wanted to dismiss it as idle gossip, the kind of rumor that always followed wealth. But later, as she lingered near the edge of the room, while Charles was drawn into a conversation with a senator, she heard more. Two men spoke in tones low enough to be secret, but sharp enough to wound. As long as Charles signs off, no one questions it. The words rang in her ears, and suddenly the clink of glasses and the hum of voices faded. Offshore. Signatures. Charles's name tangled with whispers of corruption. Her pulse raced. She reminded herself not to jump to conclusions, not to believe every fragment of overheard conversation. But the implication was clear and impossible to ignore. When Charles returned to her side, his gaze caught hers immediately. It was uncanny the way he seemed to sense shifts in her mood, as though they were changes in the air pressure. "You're quiet." He observed his tone low, his eyes scanning her face. "I'm just tired," she lied, forcing a smile. His stare lingered searching before he nodded once, letting the lie stand. The night wore on, and eventually they slipped away. The city glittered beneath the glass walls, a velvet sky studded with light, while Charlotte's mind churned with dissonance. She wanted to believe the man who had steadied her in a supermarket aisle, who had laughed softly in her kitchen, could not be guilty of such things. She wanted to believe the hand that guided her on a dance floor belonged to someone good. But her heart warred with her mind, and suspicion gnawed like teeth. Days later, the whispers grew louder. Articles began surfacing rumors of offshore accounts, of questionable transfers of signatures that bore Charles Martin's name. Headlines suggested scandal, and though nothing had been proven, the smoke was thick enough to suggest fire. Charlotte buried herself in her work sketching late into the night, but her hands trembled too much to draw straight lines. Every design blurred, every thought twisted back to him. She told herself to stay away, to remember her promise, that this was only pretend. But fate has a way of disregarding boundaries. One evening, she found herself standing in the lobby of Martin Technologies. The tower loomed above her, glass and steel rising into the foggy San Francisco night, glowing like a monument to power. Inside the lobby gleamed with marble and steel, employees moving with the clipped pace of people who belonged. Charlotte felt like an intruder, her heart pounding as she slipped past her presence unnoticed in the tide of bodies. She told herself she only needed answers. She could not let herself care, not in the way her heart begged her to, but she needed truth. A door had been left ajar. She moved through it, before fear could stop her. The records room smelled of ink and paper, the air heavy with the weight of secrets. Rows of files lined the shelves, neat and silent, each one carrying fragments of an empire. Her fingers shook as she scanned the labels until she found it, BLC Holdings. She pulled the folder free, and inside, her worst fear took shape. Transfer orders, offshore accounts, Cayman Islands, and at the bottom of each document, the bold, decisive stroke of a signature she recognized, Charles Martin. Her throat tightened, her pulse roaring in her ears. If this was true, if these were real, then the man she was falling into was not savior, but destroyer. But even as the thought pierced her, another voice whispered, "This feels like a trap." The papers were too neat, too convenient. The door behind her slammed shut. "What are you doing here?" The folder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the floor like broken promises. She turned, her blood freezing. Charles stood in the doorway, his figure filling it, his expression thunderous. His eyes were no longer cool steel, but storm, burning with betrayal. I needed to know," she stammered. His voice was low, ragged with anger. "Know what? Whether the man you've been pretending to stand beside is a criminal?" Charlotte's chest heaved. "I heard whispers. Offshore accounts. Your name." I couldn't ignore it. He strode forward, snatching the folder from her hands, slamming it shut with a force that made her flinch. "So you decided to snoop through my company, like a journalist chasing headlines." The words cut deep, sharper than he could know. Once before she'd turned to design. She had been a journalist briefly, until the weight of disillusionment and endless comparisons to her sister pushed her away. She had sworn to leave that world behind. And yet here she was again, digging, questioning, doubting. "Tell me it isn't true," she whispered desperately. "Tell me you're not part of this." For the first time since she'd met him, his composure cracked. His jaw clenched. His chest rose sharply with each breath. His voice, when it came, was not calm, but wounded. "You came into my life under false pretenses. You let me believe you were different. And all the while you were watching, waiting for me to slip." Tears burned her eyes. "No, Charles. It didn't start that way. I was curious. Suspicious maybe, but then what?" His eyes blazed. "You decided to fall in love with your story." The words landed like a blow. Her throat closed, but she forced the truth out anyway. "I didn't mean to. I never planned it. But I care for you. And I needed to know if you were worth trusting with my heart." His laugh was sharp, bitter. "You think I asked for your heart? All I needed was a partner who could play a role. And you've turned it into betrayal." "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "If someone is setting you up, if Victor—" At the name, his face darkened, his hand tightening around the folder until his knuckles whitened. "Enough. I don't want to hear another excuse. It's over, Charlotte. Whatever this was, whatever you thought it could be, it ends now. Don't ever come near me again." The finality in his tone shattered her. He walked past her, his cologne sharp, his footsteps echoing like thunder down the hall. She stood frozen among the scattered papers, her chest caving inward, her hands trembling as though they no longer belonged to her. She wanted to scream after him, to tell him she believed in him, despite the documents, despite the whispers. But her voice failed her. Hours later, Charlotte sat alone in her studio, the city lights glowing against her window. The sketches on her desk blurred behind her tears. She pressed her fists against her eyes, whispering into the silence, "I didn't want to betray you. I only wanted the truth." But the silence did not answer, and in the stillness of that night, She knew her world had fractured, and she no longer knew how to piece it back together. The news broke on a Monday morning, and it spread like fire in a dry forest. Charlotte was in her studio unlocking the door with her key when her phone buzzed with the alert. She glanced down, expecting a message from a client, or perhaps Celeste checking in after the wedding. Instead, the headline glared at her from the small screen like a knife pressed against her throat. Charles Martin, implicated in offshore money laundering scandal. Documents reveal signature on transfers to Cayman accounts. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. She clicked the article eyes, scanning line after line that blurred together financial transfers. Corporate shell companies blurred images of signatures that she knew all too well. His name bold and unmistakable at the bottom of every page. His empire called into question his reputation, shredded his image, repainted overnight from visionary to villain. Charlotte sank into the nearest chair, the leather cold beneath her. She felt as though the air had been punched from her lungs. She wanted to dismiss it all, to cling to the memory of the man who had stood in her kitchen sleeves, rolled chopping vegetables with more concentration than a billionaire should. But the images burned into her eyes. The words hammered against her chest. Clients began canceling within hours. One after another, polite emails arrived with sharp edges hidden in their brevity. Due to recent developments, we've decided to postpone the project. Or worse, we'll be going in a different direction. They were afraid to be associated with the woman who had been photographed on Charles Martin's arm, the woman who was suddenly plastered across gossip sites under the caption, "The Billionaire's Secret Girlfriend." In the aisles of the grocery store, she heard it whispered behind her. "That's her. That's the one." Eyes trailed her, not with curiosity now, but with suspicion, with disdain. She stopped going out except for necessities, and even then, the weight of the stairs pressed against her skin until she could hardly breathe. At night, she sat by her window watching the fog curl across the city, wondering if he was out there somewhere, watching the same skyline. Did he think of her? Did he curse her name? Did he regret the words he had spat at her in the records room, the way he had ended it with finality? Or had she been nothing more than a convenient pawn in his game? Discarded the moment she reached too close to the truth, Celeste called once, her voice trembling through the line. "I saw the news," she whispered. "Charlotte, are you all right?" "I'm fine." Charlotte lied, her throat raw. "You don't sound fine. Tell me the truth. Did you love him?" The question lodged like glass in her chest. She pressed her lips together, the silence heavy. "I don't know," she whispered at last before ending the call. But the truth pulsed inside her like a wound that refused to close. She had loved him, and perhaps she still did, despite everything. The newspapers were merciless. Stock prices plunged. Investors withdrew. Former allies of Charles distanced themselves with statements crafted by lawyers. Every headline painted him as a cold-blooded mogul undone by greed. And still, some stubborn, reckless part of Charlotte's heart insisted that something was wrong. The man who had told her about his mother's piano, who had carried groceries into her kitchen, who had looked at her with a vulnerability that could not be faked, he could not be the man those headlines described. So she began to dig, quietly at first. She contacted old acquaintances from her brief years as a journalist, voices who still lingered in the shadows of finance and politics. She pieced together fragments of financial reports, whispers in back corridors, rumors traded in hushed tones. Each trail circled back to one name, Victor Cross. The more she uncovered, the more the puzzle fit together in terrible clarity. Victor had orchestrated everything. The forged documents, The false transfers, the signatures too precise to be accidental. He had planted the evidence so that when the story broke, all fingers would point to Charles, and it had worked flawlessly. But before she could carry her findings to him, the danger found her. It was late, the streets wrapped in fog, thick enough to choke the lamps, when she locked her studio and started toward home. Her footsteps echoed against the damp pavement, her bag clutched close. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the shadows were only shadows. Then the screech of tires tore through the silence. A black SUV slid to the curb doors flinging open. Men in dark clothing spilled out their movements sharp and deliberate. Charlotte's breath caught fear rising like a tide in her chest. "Miss Mitchell," one of them said, his voice cold as steel. "You've been asking too many questions." She turned to run, but strong arms seized her, dragging her toward the vehicle. She screamed, kicked, struggled, but the fog swallowed her cries. Within seconds, she was shoved inside the door, slamming shut behind her. The SUV roared into the night, the city blurring past unseen. They blindfolded her, bound her wrists, until the leather bit into her skin. The world became darkness and muffled voices. "Victor wants it finished tonight," one muttered. Her blood ran cold. When the blindfold was ripped away at last, she blinked against harsh light. The smell of oil and rust filled her lungs. A warehouse stretched around her, empty, but for shadows and echoes. And in the center stood Victor Cross, immaculate in a gray suit, his smile sharp and cruel. He looked every inch the man she had heard whispered about. "Charlotte Mitchell," he drawled. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing." Her knees trembled, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "You framed him," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You forged those signatures. You destroyed him." Victor's laugh was slow, mocking. "Framed, oh my dear. I liberated him. He built the empire, but he was too sentimental, too concerned with morality. He would never have signed those papers willingly, so I made sure he did. A forgery here, a falsified record there. And suddenly the king looks like the criminal." Rage burned in her chest. "You ruined him for your own power." Victor leaned closer, his eyes cold as ice. "And now you know too much, which means you won't be leaving this place." He turned to his men. "Make it clean." Charlotte's breath hitched. She pulled against the bindings, desperate, but the ropes held. Her mind screamed not for herself, but for him. If she died here, if she disappeared, Charles would never know she believed him, never know she had found the truth. The heavy slam of doors cut through the tension. Boots pounded against gravel, shouts erupting. "Stand down," a commanding voice roared. Her heart jolted. She knew that voice. Charles Martin strode into the warehouse, flanked by a team of private security. His gray eyes burned with fury, his suit dark against the harsh lights. Victor's men scrambled, weapons raised, but Charles's team moved with precision, disarming them with brutal efficiency. Chaos exploded around her, shouts, grunts, the crack of fists against flesh. But all Charlotte saw was him cutting through the storm with unwavering focus. "Untie her," he barked, and one of his men sliced through the ropes. Charlotte stumbled forward, her wrists raw, and before she could fall, Charles's arms were around her, pulling her against him. "You came," she whispered, her voice breaking. His jaw tightened, his breath ragged against her ear. "Did you really think I'd let them take you?" A gunshot cracked through the air. Charlotte screamed as Charles twisted, shoving her behind him. The bullet grazed his arm, tearing through the fabric of his suit. He barely flinched, his focus locked on Victor, who stood at the far end of the warehouse, a pistol smoking in his hand. "Always the hero," Victor sneered. Too bad you won't live long enough to see me take everything you built." But before Victor could fire again, Charles's security team tackled him to the ground, wrenching the weapon from his grip. Shouts echoed the struggle, brief but decisive. Within moments, Victor Cross was pinned, his face twisted in rage. Charles pressed a hand to his bleeding arm, his gaze never leaving Charlotte. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head quickly, tears spilling. "No, but you—" "It's nothing," he said firmly, though his voice softened as his thumb brushed her cheek. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." She clutched his sleeve, her chest heaving. "Why? After everything I did, after you told me it was over, why would you come for me for the first time since she had met him?" His composure cracked. His voice was raw, stripped of armor. "Because I couldn't lose you. Not to him, not to anyone." The words shattered something inside her. She buried her face against his chest, sobs shaking her as around them Victor was dragged away in handcuffs, cursing Charles's name. She barely heard. All she felt was the solidity of him, the way his arms closed around her, like a vow, the truth undeniable. He had not abandoned her. He had risked everything to save her, and in that moment, Charlotte knew with terrifying certainty what had begun as pretense had become the only truth she could no longer deny. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet dread. Machines hummed softly in the corners, their beeping steady and indifferent. Charles sat propped up in the narrow bed, his arms swathed in fresh bandages, his suit jacket discarded on a chair that looked far too ordinary for the man who wore it. Even wounded, he carried that impossible aura of command, the kind that made strangers instinctively step aside. But when his eyes lifted and found her standing hesitantly in the doorway, the air between them softened. Charlotte froze her pulse, stumbling. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind during the long drive over, telling herself she would be calm, measured, detached if she had to be. But all those rehearsals vanished when she saw him there, pale but unbroken, his gaze steady, despite the shadows under his eyes. She gripped the door frame as though it could keep her from unraveling. "You came," he said quietly, as if he hadn't believed she would. Her throat tightened. "After what you did last night, how could I not?" The faintest curve touched his lips, not quite a smile, but something close. He lifted his uninjured hand, beckoning her closer. She crossed the room slowly, each step pulling her deeper into the storm of emotions she had been trying so hard to hold back. She sank into the chair beside his bed, unable to speak at first. For a long moment, silence pressed between them, heavy with all the things unsaid. "I stayed awake all night," Charles murmured at last, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Not because of the pain, because I thought if I closed my eyes, I might lose the chance to tell you what I should have said a long time ago." Charlotte's breath caught. She wanted to look away to shield herself, but his gaze anchored her. "Charles." He closed his hand over hers, firm and steady. "I don't want to pretend anymore. Not at galas, not in front of shareholders, not for the world. I want you. Only you." The words cracked something inside her. Tears pricked her eyes, spilling before she could stop them. "You can't just say that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can't nearly die for me and then tell me this is real. It was supposed to be temporary. A game, an act. It was never temporary for me." His voice carried no hesitation, only raw truth. "I lied to myself, told myself it was convenient strategy, survival. But every moment with you dismantled that lie. You weren't a prop, Charlotte. You became the only thing that mattered." She pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to hold in the sob that rose from deep inside her. "I thought I ruined everything. I thought you hated me for what I did." Charles reached out his fingers, brushing her chin, tilting her face toward his so she could not escape his gaze. His gray eyes glistened, stormy, yet tender. "I was angry because I cared. I was terrified you'd uncover the worst of me and leave. But instead, you uncovered the truth. You stayed. Even when I pushed you away, you fought to see who I really was. No one has ever done that for me." Her tears fell freely now. She leaned forward, her forehead brushing his, her heart pounding. "I was reckless. I put myself in danger. And I nearly lost my mind, thinking of what they would do to you." He admitted, his voice rough. "Charlotte, if you hadn't been there, Victor might have destroyed me completely. But you gave me reason to fight to survive." The silence that followed was thick with emotion, broken only by the rhythm of the monitor beside them. Charlotte let the truth spill from her, her words trembling. "I don't want to pretend either. I never did. Somewhere between the dances and the late nights and the grocery aisles, I fell in love with you. And I was so afraid you wouldn't want me back." His breath hitched. His hand tightened around hers, with a desperation that broke through every layer of his composure. "I do. More than I've ever wanted anything." Their lips met in a kiss that was both desperate and gentle, the kind that carried every wound, every secret, every hope they had been too afraid to speak. It was not staged, not performed for the eyes of strangers. It was theirs alone, raw and real. When they pulled apart, Charles rested his forehead against hers, whispering like a vow, "No more pretending." She smiled through her tears, her heart lighter than it had ever been. "No more pretending," she echoed. The days that followed blurred into a fragile rhythm of recovery. The headlines shifted within hours of Victor's arrest. Victor Cross detained in money laundering scheme. Charles Martin cleared of all charges. The same news outlets that had branded him a criminal now painted him as a man, vindicated a titan who had survived betrayal within his own ranks. Photographs showed Victor in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage, while Charles, his arm bandaged, stood before reporters with calm dignity. But for Charlotte, the true victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet moments she spent at his bedside, reading aloud from a book she pulled from the hospital library, or in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, as if memorizing her presence. One evening, as the city lights flickered beyond the window, Charlotte caught him staring again. "What is it?" she asked softly. He shook his head, the faintest smile touching his lips. "I keep thinking how easily I could have lost this. Lost you." "You nearly did," she whispered, her voice trembling. "When you told me it was over, I thought—" She broke off, swallowing hard. "I was a fool," he admitted. "A man who thought trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But you broke through that. And I don't want to go back." Her heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, so unlike the untouchable billionaire the world knew. She leaned closer, brushing her lips against his forehead. "Then don't. We've both lived in shadows long enough." The following week, Charles was discharged, though, against the protests of his doctors. Charlotte accompanied him back to his penthouse, a space that had once felt intimidating, but now seemed oddly quiet, almost human. She cooked for him in the sleek, unused kitchen, laughing when she nearly burned the sauce. He stood behind her, his arms slipping around her waist, his lips brushing her neck. The intimacy startled her, but she didn't pull away. She leaned back into him, her heart whispering that she had finally found a place where she belonged. Still, shadows lingered. Victor's trial loomed ahead, and though Charles had been cleared, the scars of betrayal ran deep. At night, She sometimes woke to find him standing at the window, staring out at the skyline, his shoulders taut, as if carrying invisible weights. She would rise, slip her arms around him, press her cheek against his back. He never spoke in those moments, but his hands would cover hers, holding on as though she anchored him to the earth. One night, unable to bear the silence, she whispered, "What are you thinking that it's not over?" He murmured, "Victor may be in custody, but there are others, people who will circle waiting for weakness, and I've never had more to lose than I do now." Her chest tightened, but she lifted her chin. "Then you won't face it alone." He turned, then his gray eyes fierce yet softened by something that felt like surrender. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "I don't deserve you." She shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "No, Charles, you don't see it. You're not just the man who builds empires. You're the man who risked everything to save me. That's who I love. That's who I'll fight for." His lips met hers again, slow and reverent, as though sealing the promise that lay between them. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, Charles Martin let himself believe in forever. And as the city stretched around them glittering and alive, Charlotte knew their story was no longer built on pretense. It was written now in the fragile, fierce truth of love that had survived scandal, betrayal, and danger, and emerged stronger than either of them had dared to dream. The weeks after Charles's release from the hospital unfolded in ways Charlotte had never imagined. The city still buzzed with his name newspapers, shifting tone from condemnation to vindication, television anchors, speaking of his resilience magazines, scrambling to feature the story of a man nearly destroyed by betrayal, but now exonerated. Yet for all the noise outside the life they carved together, in the quiet spaces of his penthouse, was startlingly simple. He insisted she stay with him while he healed, though his reasons were never spoken aloud. She agreed, though her heart knew she never wanted to leave. Mornings began with the smell of coffee, though Charles still found it impossible to brew without burning the beans. She laughed at his attempts, guiding his hands with her own, the warmth of his body pressed against her, as steam curled into the air. Afternoons often disappeared into silence, him buried in documents and meetings, conducted over encrypted calls, her sketching in the sunlit corner of his study, lost in swatches of fabric and lines that carried her dreams. Evenings belonged to them, shared dinners, slow walks on the balcony overlooking San Francisco's glittering skyline, the city stretching endless and alive beneath their feet. And yet, beneath the tender rhythm of this fragile new life, shadows remained. Victor Cross was awaiting trial, but whispers suggested his reach still stretched beyond prison walls. Former allies of Charles's company circled like sharks, sensing weakness despite his cleared name. Every day brought new battles, lawsuits filed, contracts, questioned board members pressing for reassurance that Martin Technologies was still unshakable. Charlotte saw the toll it took on him. At board meetings, his expression was as composed as marble, his voice precise and unwavering. But at night, when exhaustion stripped him bare, she found him staring at the ceiling, his hand clenched in a fist, as though still gripping the empire he had nearly lost. She would slip beside him, her fingers threading through his, her whisper steady in the dark. "You don't have to hold the world alone anymore." And he would breathe out slowly, letting the walls fall for just a moment. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of meetings, he stood at the balcony, with a glass of scotch in hand, the lights of the Bay Bridge flickering in the distance. Charlotte joined him quietly, her silk robe brushing against his arm as the wind tangled her hair. "They don't trust me," he admitted, his voice low, almost as though speaking to the night instead of her. even cleared of charges, even with Victor behind bars. They're waiting for me to stumble, and I can't afford to stumble. Her heart ached at the weariness in his tone. She touched his arm, gently grounding him. Then let them wait. Let them doubt. The people who matter will see who you really are. I did. His gaze shifted to her then, and something in his eyes cracked. He set the glass aside and cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs brushing the soft trail of tears she hadn't realized had fallen. You've given me more than faith, Charlotte. You've given me a reason to fight that has nothing to do with power. She leaned into his touch, whispering against his skin, and you've given me a place where I'm not invisible. Their lips met slow and tender, carrying the weight of promises too fragile to put into words. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist, but the world had a way of intruding. The following weekend, Charles insisted on attending a charity gala hosted at one of the city's most prestigious museums. If I don't show my face, he told her, adjusting his cufflinks with calm precision, they'll think I'm hiding, and I won't give them that satisfaction. Charlotte hesitated, smoothing the emerald gown she had tailored for herself. She had never cared for cameras or red carpets, but she understood. She slipped her hand into his as they stepped out of the black Bentley flashes, erupting like lightning against the night. Reporters shouted questions, their voices sharp. Mr. Martin, how do you respond to allegations of negligence? Who is the woman at your side? Charlotte, were you aware of his dealings? Charles's arm tightened protectively around her waist, guiding her through the chaos with the composure of a man who could bend storms. Inside the museum glittered with chandeliers and priceless art, but the weight of eyes followed them everywhere. Charlotte forced herself to hold her head high, to smile when introductions came, to answer polite questions with poise. At one point, a senator's wife leaned in, her voice low but edged. It's brave of you to stand by him, my dear. Not everyone would choose such complicated company. Charlotte's smile didn't falter, though her pulse stumbled. Complicated doesn't mean unworthy, she replied softly, her words laced with quiet steel. The woman blinked, taken aback, before nodding with a faint smile. Later, as they stood near the grand piano that gleamed in the corner, Charlotte noticed Charles's gaze linger. My mother used to play, he murmured, his voice barely audible above the hum of conversation. She turned toward him, startled. He rarely spoke of his past. His eyes darkened, gray, stormy with memory. She believed music could teach patience. She tried to teach me, but I was too stubborn. She died when I was 17. Her breath caught. She saw then not the billionaire, not the empire builder, but the boy who had lost his mother, too soon, shaped by a father who demanded perfection instead of comfort. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I wish I had known her. She must have been remarkable to raise someone who can stand against the world. His gaze softened, a shadow of vulnerability flickering there. Sometimes I wonder if she'd recognize me at all. Before she could respond, a sudden hush spread through the room. Conversations faltered, eyes turning toward the entrance. A man in a tailored suit had just arrived, his smile too sharp, his presence commanding in a way that sent a chill through Charlotte's spine. She heard his name whispered like poison. Victor Cross. Her chest tightened. He was supposed to be behind bars awaiting trial. Yet here he was, walking into the gala as though nothing had touched him. Reporters surged toward him, flashes erupting again, voices clamoring. Mr. Cross, do you deny the charges? Is it true you plan to countersue Martin Technologies? Charlotte's hand gripped Charles's arm instinctively. How is he here? She whispered. Charles's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. Bail. His lawyers are the best money can buy. The air between them shifted tense and charged. Across the room, Victor's gaze swept the crowd until it landed on them. His smile widened, deliberate, and he raised a glass in mocking salute. The gesture was small, but it carried venom. Stay close to me, Charles murmured, his voice low but unyielding. Charlotte nodded, though her heart pounded. She had thought the nightmare was over, that Victor's arrest had closed the chapter. But seeing him free, prowling the same world they occupied, reminded her that battles were far from finished. As the night wore on, whispers followed them like shadows. Some spoke of loyalty, others of suspicion. Charlotte forced herself to keep smiling to play her part, though her mind swirled with fear and anger. When they finally slipped back into the Bentley, the city racing past in streaks of light, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He's not done, she said softly. No, Charles agreed, his hand covering hers with steady weight. But neither am I. Back at the penthouse, the city stretched below them, restless and alive. Charlotte stood by the window, her reflection trembling in the glass, her thoughts tangled. Behind her, Charles approached his presence, grounding. He wrapped his arms around her from behind his chin, resting lightly against her shoulder. Whatever comes, he whispered, we face it together. Her chest ached, but she turned her head, pressing her lips to his jaw. Together she echoed her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. That night, as they lay side by side in the quiet of his room, Charlotte stared into the darkness, unable to sleep. She knew the fight ahead would be brutal, that Victor Cross would not go quietly, that the world's judgment would not fade easily. But as Charles's steady breath warmed her skin, she also knew she was no longer the forgotten twin, sitting alone at her sister's wedding. She was the woman standing at the side of a man the world wanted to tear down. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to fight not only for him, but for them both. The city seemed quieter in the days that followed Victor Cross's reappearance, though Charlotte knew it was only an illusion. Beneath the surface, the storm was gathering. Headlines speculated endlessly, each article sharper than the last. Cross claims, innocence points, finger back at Martin. Upcoming trial promises explosive revelations. The media thrived on the drama, and even strangers on the street whispered, as Charlotte passed their words slicing through the air like knives. Charles bore it all with his usual steel composure, but Charlotte could see the cracks when they were alone. He worked longer hours, his study light burning well past midnight. Sometimes she found him at the window, hands braced on the glass, jaw clenched, as though he were holding back the entire city with sheer will. One evening she slipped behind him, sliding her arms around his waist, her cheek pressed to his back. You don't have to fight this alone. His hand covered hers, warm and strong. If I falter now, I lose everything. You won't, she whispered, not while I'm here. He turned, then his gray eyes searching hers, as if testing whether she truly understood the weight of what she was promising. When he finally lowered his lips to hers, the kiss was fierce, carrying all the desperation he never allowed himself to show. The trial began 2 weeks later. The courthouse swarmed with cameras, protesters, and reporters hungry for blood. Charlotte sat in the gallery, her heart pounding as Victor Cross took the stand. His lawyers painted him as a loyal second-in-command, betrayed by a ruthless CEO. He smirked through his testimony, his words crafted to wound. Charles Martin was always the puppeteer. I merely carried out his orders. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Charlotte's stomach twisted, rage and fear colliding inside her. She glanced at Charles, who sat at the defense table, his posture calm, but his eyes burning. He didn't look at Victor once, as though acknowledging him would grant him power. The prosecution unveiled document after document, the forged signatures Victor had orchestrated. Charlotte's pulse raced because she knew the truth. She had pieced it together from fragments, whispers, and shadows. Victor's downfall hinged on proof, and she realized with icy clarity that she might hold the missing piece. That night, she returned to Charles's penthouse restless. While he met with his lawyers, she pulled open the folder she had once stolen from the records room, the one she had never been able to throw away. Among the papers, she found what she had almost missed, before two signatures side by side, one clearly authentic, the other slightly off in rhythm, as though traced too carefully. To anyone else, they looked identical, but to her designer's eye, trained to see the subtle shift of a line, the difference was undeniable. Her heart pounded. This was it, the evidence to expose Victor for what he was. The next morning, she brought it to Charles. He studied the papers, his expression unreadable, until at last his lips curved into something fierce and dangerous. "You've just saved everything," he said, his voice low, his gaze on her with an intensity that made her breath falter. "Not just me, us." The final day of testimony arrived, the air in the courtroom thick with anticipation. Victor lounged in his seat, his arrogance unshaken, when the defense presented Charlotte as a witness. Gasps rippled through the room. She walked forward, her steps steady, though her knees trembled. On the stand, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying. She described the night she had overheard Victor's men whispering about Cayman accounts, the forged documents, and finally the differences she had discovered between the signatures. She projected them onto the screen, pointing out the slight tremor in the forged line, the lack of natural flow in the curves. "I am a designer," she said firmly. "Details are my life. These signatures may fool the untrained eye, but they are not the same. Victor Cross forged them." The courtroom erupted. Victor shot to his feet, shouting, his mask cracking. "She's lying. She's nothing but his mistress." But the judge's gavel slammed, silencing him. And in that silence, the truth settled like a blade. By the end of the day, Victor's empire of deceit collapsed. The jury saw through the performance, and the guilty verdict rang out like a bell tolling the end of an era. Victor Cross was led away in handcuffs, his face twisted in fury, his threats echoing uselessly in the air. When it was over, Charles turned to Charlotte in the corridor outside the courtroom. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, but for a moment, the world blurred. He cupped her face with both hands, his voice low and raw. "You did this. You saved me." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "No, we saved each other." He kissed her, then, not caring about the crowd, about the flashes, about the world watching. For once, it wasn't performance. It was truth. The headlines the next day told a different story. Victor Cross convicted in fraud scandal. Charles Martin vindicated. But the photo that spread across front pages was not of Victor's defeat. It was of Charles and Charlotte outside the courthouse, their hands intertwined, their gazes locked, a picture of unity that no rumor could shatter. Months passed, and the storm began to fade. Investors returned. The company rebuilt. Charles's name, once dragged through mud, gleamed brighter than before. Yet for Charlotte, the true victory was quieter. Her studio flourished, commissions arriving from clients who had once dismissed her. Her designs graced penthouses and galleries alike, her talent finally seen not as the shadow of her sister, but as her own light. One summer evening, a year after it had all begun, the vineyards of Napa Valley shimmered again under the golden sun. But this time, it was Charlotte who stood at the center of the garden, her ivory silk gown flowing with the breeze. She had designed it herself. Simple, elegant, and radiant. A crown of fresh roses rested in her curls, her smile brighter than any chandelier. Celeste stood near the front row, her eyes shining as she whispered to her husband, "From the forgotten twin at my wedding to the bride of a man who would burn the world for her." "Who would have guessed?" Charlotte laughed softly, her throat tight with emotion. At the end of the aisle, Charles waited, tall and steady, in a tailored suit, his gray eyes fixed on her as though nothing else in the world existed. When she reached him, he took her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles in the same quiet gesture that had once steadied her in a room full of strangers. The officiant's words faded into the background as Charles leaned closer, whispering for her ears alone. "This time, Charlotte Mitchell, it's forever." Her tears blurred the world, but her smile broke radiant. "No more pretending," she whispered back. The vows they exchanged were not elaborate or rehearsed. They were promises spoken from the heart, to trust, to fight, to never let the weight of the world crush what they had built together. When their lips met, sealing it, the applause rose around them, blending with the rustle of leaves and the hum of cicadas in the vineyard heat. That evening, lanterns glowed between the vines' fireworks, bursting above the hills, just as they had on the night Charles first whispered, "Pretend you're with me." But now there was no pretense, no shadows, no lies, only love, raw and undeniable. Charlotte leaned against his shoulder, his arm wrapped firmly around her as they watched the sky explode with color. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "Every day," he admitted. "It was the night I stopped living behind walls, and the night I stopped living in someone else's shadow," she said, her eyes shining. He turned, pressing a kiss to her lips, gentle and certain. And as laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and love lingered in the air like roses and ripe grapes, Charlotte knew their story had begun with pretense, but ended in truth. The girl who once sat alone at her sister's wedding was now a woman who would never be alone again.